In the heart of the city, beyond the neon lights and bustling streets, lay an abandoned sector known as the Forgotten District. Decades ago, it had been a lively neighborhood, but a tragic fire swept through the area, reducing entire blocks to ashes and claiming hundreds of lives. Since then, no one had dared rebuild. The ashes of the past clung to the streets like an eternal fog, and rumors whispered of strange occurrences, of figures seen at the corners of alleys that vanish when approached, and of whispers that echoed through empty corridors. Over time, it became clear that something was festering in the Forgotten District. Gangs of ghosts began to emerge, spectral entities drawn to the power of the place, clashing for control over the lost souls that still wandered the ruins. Each gang had its own territory. The Vespers, with their silent, shadowy forms, stalked the subway tunnels, their eyes glowing faintly in the dark. The Hollows, grotesque figures of those who had perished in the fire, roamed the blackened remains of old apartment buildings. And the Wraiths, the most dangerous of all, gathered in the burnt-out factory at the district's edge. Their presence felt like a cold hand on your throat. These ghosts were not mindless apparitions. They had gained a strange intelligence, organizing themselves, almost like the living once had. There was a balance, tenuous yet stable. The city authorities, unaware of the spectral conflicts, left the Forgotten District alone, content to let it rot. But one night, everything changed. It started with a violent rift that tore through the sky above the district. No one knew what caused it, a breach between worlds, perhaps, or a disturbance in the fabric of death itself. The ghosts began to behave erratically, more violently than ever before. Their once structured gangs descended into chaos, and what had once been eerie territory disputes turned into full-blown war. Ghosts that had been allies now turned on each other, their wails filling the night air, shaking windows miles away. The city, for the first time in years, took notice. Yet, for all the commotion, no one dared venture into the Forgotten District. The police sent drones, but they returned with only static-filled footage, blurs of light, sudden shadows, and strange bursts of energy. The drones malfunctioned, one by one, until none returned at all. In the days that followed, things took a darker turn. The gangs of ghosts began to merge in unnatural ways, blending together in grotesque forms. Once individual spirits, they were now amalgamations of suffering, twisted by the breach in the sky. These new entities were unpredictable, even more dangerous than before. They no longer sought to control territories, but seemed driven by a singular purpose: to escape the Forgotten District. It was on the seventh night that they succeeded. No one knew how it happened, but the barrier that had once kept the ghosts contained within the district shattered. The strange energy that had kept them confined now dissipated, allowing them to bleed into the rest of the city. Suddenly, the hauntings were no longer limited to the shadowy ruins. Ghostly figures appeared in apartment complexes, in subway stations, in crowded streets, causing panic wherever they went. Reports flooded in of people being possessed, of cold hands dragging the living into darkness. The city was on the verge of collapse. Yet, even amid the chaos, there was something even more sinister lurking beneath the surface. As the ghostly gang spread, rumors began to circulate that the rift had been no accident. Something had intentionally torn open the fabric of the Forgotten District, and that force, whatever it was, had not yet revealed its true nature. In the heart of the chaos, a group of ghost hunters, long thought to be charlatans, prepared to venture into the ruins of the Forgotten District. They had reason to believe the answer lay there, in the remnants of the gangs, in whatever had torn open the veil between life and death. But the risks were great. The city was falling into darkness, and the ghosts were only the beginning. Something much worse was coming through that rift, and the Forgotten District was no longer forgotten. The city braced for what was to come, but deep down, everyone knew the worst had yet to reveal itself. The ghost hunters arrived at the outskirts of the Forgotten District just as the sun sank below the horizon, casting long, eerie shadows over the crumbling buildings. They called themselves the Veilwalkers **, a ragtag group with a questionable reputation. But they had a secret. They possessed ancient knowledge passed down through generations, knowledge that could push back against the growing darkness. Leading them was Sarah Quinn, a woman hardened by years of battling the supernatural. Her eyes, sharp and calculating, scanned the ruins as they moved deeper into the district. The Veil Walkers had all heard the whispers. Someone or something had torn the rift open deliberately. But why? And for what purpose? The night was unnaturally silent as they approached the heart of the Forgotten District. No ghostly apparitions, no wails of the dead. Even the wines seemed to hold their breath. But the feeling of dread was palpable, thick in the air. The further they ventured, the more they felt an oppressive force pressing down on them, as though something was watching, waiting. They finally reached the burnt-out husk of the factory, where the race had once ruled. But now, it stood empty, no sign of the spectral gang that had terrorized this place for years. All that remained was an unsettling quiet and the lingering cold of death. Sarah's team began their preparations, setting up ritual wards and lighting candles infused with protective herbs. Yet, just as they were about to begin, one of the Veil Walkers, Tom, froze mid-step. His eyes widened, staring into the shadows at the far end of the factory floor. "Do you hear that?" he whispered, his voice shaking. The others paused. At first, there was nothing, only the crackling of candles. But then, faintly, from the depths of the darkness, came a sound. A whisper, a single voice, so soft it could barely be heard. But it wasn't just one voice. More voices followed, overlapping, building in volume. They weren't ghostly wails, they were voices of the living. "They're calling for help," Sarah muttered, her brow furrowed. But they sound distant, as if drawn by invisible hands. The Veil Walkers were pulled toward the source of the whispers. The deeper they ventured into the factory, the more distorted the voices became, until they stumbled upon a strange sight. A massive, swirling vortex of blackened mist hovering in the air, the center of the rift. Sarah felt the hairs on the back of her neck rise. The rift wasn't just a tear in the veil between life and death, it was something more. The whispers from inside it were human, desperate, like trapped souls pleading for release. The ghostly gangs may have escaped the Forgotten District, but something else was trying to come through. Something that hadn't yet succeeded. "What is that?" Tom whispered, unable to look away. "It's not just a tear," Sarah said, her voice barely above a breath. "It's a prison." The realization hit her like a ton of bricks. This was no accident. The rift was never meant to release the ghosts, it was designed to open the prison of something far worse. Something ancient. Something that had been locked away for eons by forces long forgotten. And now, with the ghosts unleashed on the city, this entity, this dark force, was using the chaos as cover to break free. "We have to close it," Sarah ordered, her voice trembling slightly. "Now." But as they began their ritual to seal the rift, the temperature dropped sharply, and a new voice echoed from within the swirling mist. It was no longer a whisper, but a deep, guttural growl. It felt alive, powerful, and filled with an ancient malice. It spoke in a language none of them recognized, but its meaning was clear. They had been noticed. Suddenly, the rift expanded, sending out a shockwave of cold energy that knocked the Veil Walkers off their feet. In the center of the vortex, a form began to emerge, a towering, shadowy figure, indistinct but with glowing eyes that radiated malevolence. It wasn't a ghost. It was something older, something elemental. A dark spirit, imprisoned for centuries, now on the verge of freedom. Sarah scrambled to her feet, her heart racing. The Veil Walkers continued their ritual, chanting louder, trying to force the entity back. But with each word they spoke, the figure grew clearer, more defined, as if feeding off their efforts. It was no longer just breaking through the rift, it was absorbing their energy to accelerate its escape. "We're not going to make it," Tom gasped, his face pale with fear. But just as all seemed lost, the rift flickered for a moment, and the entity paused. It turned its gaze away from the Veil Walkers and looked towards the city beyond the Forgotten District. For a split second, Sarah thought she saw fear in its glowing eyes. And then, just as quickly, the rift snapped shut with a deafening crack, throwing the Veil Walkers backward in a burst of energy. The swirling mist vanished, and the factory floor was eerily still once more. The Veil Walkers, bruised and shaken, slowly rose to their feet, exchanging confused glances. "Did Did we stop it? Tom asked, his voice barely audible. Sarah looked around, her instincts telling her that something was wrong. The rift was closed, yes, but they hadn't stopped whatever was inside. It had simply paused. No, Sarah said, her voice grim. We didn't stop it. It's waiting. She could feel it. Whatever was trapped inside that rift was still there, watching, waiting for the right moment to finish what it had started. The ghosts were just the beginning, a diversion to distract them from the true threat. And somewhere out there, in the city now crawling with specters, this ancient entity had already found its way into the world. Or worse, had found a host. The city wasn't safe. Not yet. The real danger was still lurking in the shadows, and the Veilwalkers had only delayed the inevitable. And so, with the ghosts still roaming the streets and an unknown darkness rising from the depths of the Forgotten District, Sarah knew the true battle had yet to begin. The Veilwalkers staggered out of the factory, their faces pale and drawn. The air outside was thick with a heavy mist that clung to the streets, suffocating the light from the moon. Sarah led the group, her mind racing, as she tried to make sense of what had just happened. They had delayed the entity's escape, but she knew deep down that it was far from over. As they made their way back toward the edge of the Forgotten District, they began to notice subtle changes in the city around them. Shadows danced unnaturally along the walls, and distorted figures moved in the distance, slipping between the buildings. At first, the Veilwalkers assumed it was the ghost gang still roaming, but something was different. These shapes were darker, more twisted than the spirits they had encountered before. Then came the laughter. It started as a low, guttural chuckle echoing from the depths of the mist, barely discernible. But as they continued, the laughter grew louder, more distorted, until it filled the air around them, coming from all directions. The sound seemed to wrap around their minds, crawling into their thoughts, twisting their sense of reality. Sarah gripped her pendant, a charm that had protected her through countless battles with the supernatural, but even she could feel it losing its power. The others began to falter, their breaths coming in ragged gasps as the oppressive atmosphere bore down on them. "Something's wrong," Tom whispered, his voice quivering with fear. Before anyone could respond, the mist shifted, and a figure stepped out from the shadows. It was human, or at least, it once had been. Now, it was something else entirely. Its skin was gray and cracked, and its eyes glowed with the same eerie light as the entity they had glimpsed in the rift. The figure smiled, revealing teeth too sharp, too jagged for a human mouth. "I've been waiting for you," it rasped, its voice thick with dark amusement. The Veilwalkers froze, horror sinking into their bones. Sarah recognized the figure instantly. It was Jonah, a former member of their group, who had vanished months ago while investigating a haunting. They had assumed he died now. It was clear that something far worse had happened to him. "Jonah!" Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. "No," the thing in Jonah's body said, its smile widening. "Jonah is gone. He was useful, but now I am free." Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she realized the truth. The entity had already escaped the rift. It had been using the ghost gangs as pawns, creating chaos to distract them while it quietly found its way into the world. And now, it was standing right in front of them, wearing the skin of someone they once knew. With a sudden lurch, the thing that had been Jonah lunged forward, moving faster than any human could. It grabbed Tom by the throat, lifting him off the ground effortlessly. Tom gasped for air, his eyes wide with terror, but there was no strength left to fight back. The rest of the Veilwalkers could only watch in horror as the entity drained the life from him, leaving his body limp and pale before dropping him to the ground. Panic surged through the remaining Veilwalkers. They turned to run, but the mist thickened, closing in around them, trapping them in a nightmare of shifting shadows and distant laughter. No matter where they turned, they could see figures moving just beyond their vision, twisted, unnatural things that were neither ghost nor human. "Run!" Sarah shouted, her voice desperate. But it was too late. The mist swirled violently, and out of it emerged more of the creature's former ghosts, now twisted by the entity's power. They surrounded the Veilwalkers, cutting off every escape route. Sarah fought back, slashing at them with her blade, but for every one she struck down, two more appeared. Then came the whispers, the same voices from the rift, now filling their minds, clouding their thoughts with promises of power and release. Sarah felt her grip on reality slipping, the weight of the voices pressing down on her. She knew she had to fight it, but the more she struggled, the stronger they became. In the chaos, Sarah caught sight of Jonah, or what remained of him, moving toward her. His eyes gleamed with malice, and that twisted smile never left his face. "You can't stop it," he whispered. "It's already begun." Before Sarah could react, Jonah reached out, his cold fingers brushing her forehead. Instantly, her mind was flooded with images, visions of a city consumed by darkness, of people transformed into twisted abominations, of the streets crawling with things that should never have existed. And at the center of it all, the entity, an ancient, unstoppable force, stood watching, waiting to reclaim the world for itself. Sarah screamed, falling to her knees as the visions overwhelmed her. The laughter grew louder, echoing in her mind until she could hear nothing else. The last thing she saw before the world went black was the entity's glowing eyes staring down at her, filled with cruel satisfaction. When the mist finally cleared, the Forgotten District was silent once more. The Veil Walkers were gone, their bodies lost to the darkness. But the city had changed. It was no longer just haunted by ghosts, it was something far worse. In the days that followed, strange occurrences spread like wildfire. People vanished without a trace, only to reappear as hollow, soulless shells. Unseen forces pulled at the fabric of reality, twisting the city into something unrecognizable. And in the shadows, those twisted, laughing figures began to multiply, spreading out from the Forgotten District like a plague. The city was lost, consumed by the darkness that had been lurking beneath the surface all along. And somewhere, in the heart of the chaos, the entity watched with cold, malevolent delight. It had won. There was no one left to stop it, and there never would be.